Hi and welcome back. This video is recorded a little bit after the rest of the course, so you may see a little difference between the other videos in the course and this section. Please bear with me while I explain them and also while I bring you up to speed. So what we've got here is Visual Studio Code. This has changed from Atom. So in the rest of the course we were using Atom. Now I'm using Visual Studio Code just because a few months have passed. I've come to the conclusion that Visual Studio Code is a bit better, a bit nicer to work with. Just looks a bit nicer. It has more integrations with things. If you want to keep using Atom, by all means do that. I'm just using Visual Studio Code now more often, so that's why I'm using that. A lot of the time I'm also using PyCharm, so still can use that if you want. It's also a very good tool. For our all intents and purposes, it's going to be the same, so you're not going to notice any difference between the rest of the course and this one. Just the editor looks a little bit different, but that's it. Now, in this section, we are going to look at Flask-JWT-Extended. A lot of you have asked for this section to be included in the course because it contains a key piece of functionality when we develop authentication in our REST APIs, which is token refreshing. Token refreshing allows you to get a new JWT without asking your users for their username and password again. If your JWT expires after, say, 10 minutes, every 10 minutes you have to ask your users for username and password if you don't use token refreshing. So we're going to look at Flask-JWT-Extended because it supports that, but of course I'm also going to guide you through using Flask-JWT-Extended like we have done with Flask-JWT. But because you already know a bunch of stuff, we don't have to cover absolutely everything in very slow detail. We can go quite quickly because a lot of things are very similar. Now, this code that you see here is more or less exactly the same as the code that we had at the end of the last section. There are a couple of differences, and I'm going to highlight them for you in this video. So please take the code that I provide at the start of this section. It's linked in the resources of this lecture. It's called the starter code, and that's the starter code for this section. So you can feel free to download that and give it a go. It'll be more or less the same as what we've already got. For the rest of the section, I recommend you use this code as opposed to the one in the last section because of these minor differences that I'm about to tell you about. The first minor difference is this line here. app.config propagate exceptions is true. What does this mean? Well, turns out when you're running your Flask app, if Flask-JWT raises an error, your Flask app is not going to see that error. For example, let's say Flask-JWT raises a not authorized error and it tries to return an error code 401, which means unauthorized in HTTP codes. If you don't have this, your Flask app is actually just going to return an error code 500. It's going to say, sorry, don't know what to do, so I'm just going to give you an error. If you allow propagate exceptions, that means that the Flask extensions, like Flask-JWT, can raise their own exceptions and return their own codes and their own messages to the user. So you would be then returning a specific error that Flask-JWT has told you or told your app to return. So that lets your exceptions return their own custom errors, which can be really handy at times. Now, there are a couple other small changes. For example, here I'm going to the item resource, and you'll see that most things are more or less the same. There are a couple of differences here. Previously, in the last code, we had the item model passing in, data price like that. Now we are passing in the unpacked data, which means it contains everything in the dictionary, store ID and price. So that store ID and price are getting passed to the item model as arguments. In the last section, we didn't quite have this. We were only passing in the price. So this just makes everything a little bit nicer. And we're doing the same thing down here as well, like there. The same thing applies to the store. Sorry, not the store. The store only has one name. But the same thing can be applied here in the user model. As you can see, we are passing data username and data password. Instead, we can just do data like that. That means exactly the same thing, just passes username as a named argument and password as another named argument into the user model, and the values are the ones that are coming from the parser. So it just makes things a little bit nicer, and that's why we're using that here. Now, in the item resource, we've got this list and map of the JSON. What we want to do instead is return a list comprehension, just because list comprehensions are generally a little bit faster, a little bit more readable for Python developers. So I know that we used list and map over the last few sections, but now we're going to turn over to list comprehensions just because they're a bit more Pythonic. So all we have to do to make this into a list comprehension is say x for x in x.json for x in item model query all. And that's it. Let's take that away as well. So now we're returning the JSON of x for x in all the item models that we query. And if we want, we can of course rename this to something like item or whatever else you want to name your variable, but this is just there for simplicity. In the store, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to go down here and do x.json for x in that. Again, just makes it a little bit more readable, I feel, and it's a bit more Pythonic. Okay, in these store list and item lists, we're also going to modify this slightly. So instead of accessing the query object of the store model, we're going to do store model.findAll. Now, there's a reason for this, which is I'm not a big fan of accessing the query object from within the resource. I get the feeling that it's a bit nicer if we can have a method that encapsulates accessing the query of a model and we don't make the resource access that itself. The reason for that is if you access the query object in the resource, you could essentially just, in many occasions, not use the model at all. You could just access query here, and for example here, instead of find by name, you could just use the query object. And you can do that, that's totally fine, but it starts making the resource a bit too heavy. It starts making the resource, interact with the database, if you wish, by doing the querying. And I think that can get a little bit complicated, and it was fine down here to some extent because it was only, store model.query.all. But moving forward, we want to make this a little bit better. So we are going to create this findAll function, method in the store model, and we are going to use that instead. So instead of here, we're going to do a class method, findAll, and this is just going to return cls.query.all. And that's it. And of course, we don't need a semicolon there. Sorry, I've been doing a lot of JavaScript recently, so that's not so good. Then we have a findAll for the store. We're going to add it into the item as well, and we're going to do the same thing in the item resource. So now we've added a findAll method in the item model. We're going to go to the item resource, and instead of query.all, we're going to do findAll. That's it. Remember to save the files, by the way. I tend to forget sometimes. And that's pretty close to it. We just want to add one more thing here in the JSON method of the item and the store. We are going to add just a store ID here. And it's going to be self.store ID. And we're also going to add the ID of the item just so we get a bit more information. Okay. Now, because this is getting a bit long, and we don't need that. Because this is getting a little bit long, we're just going to break it down into lines to make it a bit nicer. Like that. And of course, we do need the quotation marks there. Okay, just added two more properties, ID and store ID, into the item so that when we get it with our API, it's a bit easier to understand what's going on. In the store model, we're going to do the same. We're going to break it down into lines here, and we are going to add the ID. Just like that. Now the store is returning the ID, name, and items so that we get the ID of the store when we retrieve it using our API. Now the last thing that you may see in this project that we've not looked at before is this requirements.txt file. The requirements.txt file just contains the 3 dependencies of our project: Flask-JWT, Flask RESTful, and Flask SQL Alchemy. We're putting them here so that we can easily remember and install them into our virtual environments when we share this code with someone else, or when we go to a different computer and want to run this code, we'll very quickly know what we have to install. So that is here. Requirements.txt is a very common name for this file, so make sure to call it that, as that's the convention in Python code. So that's it for this video. I'm sorry it's been a little bit of a longer one, but I just wanted to quickly cover a few changes from the very last section of the course into this section, because a couple of things have changed just to make things a bit nicer, and now we're going to move into implementing Flask-JWT-Extended. So with that said, I'll see you on the next video.